Hey everyone, my name's Jessie. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am talking about my most surprising reads of 2020. So last video I talked about my best books of 2020. Those were all of my top favorites, but I've read a lot of really great books that I want to shout out this year. So this list today is going to be me talking about books that I ended up really enjoying, much more than I thought I would have for various reasons. And we will talk about each one in detail. So without further ado, let's just get right into this video. The first book I have to talk about that I ended up absolutely loving is An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. This is an adult sci-fi book that follows a girl who, with her friend in the middle of the night, discovers this humongous statue that just supposedly came out of nowhere in New York City, and so they film a YouTube video and put it up online of introducing this statue to the world. And basically that video overnight goes viral. And a big reason why is because these statues not only appeared in New York City, but also appeared in huge cities throughout the entire world. So now we as a society think that these statues may have come from elsewhere, outside of our planet, maybe by aliens, and we don't know why, and we're trying to figure it out. I thought that this book sounded really cute. I didn't expect to fall head over heels in love with this book as much as I did. I thought the themes around fame and social media in our culture were so relevant for today's times and were just so on the point, and I just loved it so much. And I really enjoyed just the direction of this plot and how many mysteries and questions there were, and how some of them were answered, but some of them are definitely left to the second book to answer. I just ended up having so much fun with this, much more than I thought I would. So I highly recommend if you want to check out more of a beginner sci-fi book. This is definitely very much a good starter for sci-fi if you haven't read a lot of it, because it's very light on the sci-fi themes, and it's much heavier on just themes of fame, social media, but just kind of society in general. So I thought it was really good, and I can't wait to read the second. The next book I have to talk about is Malice by John Gwynne. So this was actually the Shelf Space Book Club pick for July. I had heard a couple things about this book at that time, and I thought it sounded pretty good, but I didn't know much about it. It just wasn't as popular, I guess, and I don't know what I was expecting. So I kind of went in blind and was like, all right, let's see how this is. Oh my god, I ended up loving this. Oh, it was so good. The first 200 pages, I will say it takes a while to get your bearings in regards to who is who and why are we doing this thing. But once you get oriented to this world and to this cast of characters, oh my goodness, it is so good. Like, I loved the characters. I loved the prophecy trope in this. I thought it was fantastic. The action scenes were so good. Like, the ending of this book is so fantastic. The battle, like, I am not a visual reader, and I was able to actually visualize, for the most part, everything that was happening in this battle. It was so well choreographed and so intriguing. The political intrigue in this was just fantastic. So I ended up loving this book, and I can't wait to read the rest of The Faithful and the Fallen. And I feel like since I've read it, it's become so popular on BookTube. I see everyone talking about Malice now, and I think it's for good reason. I loved it. So I'm super excited to continue on with this series. I am really glad I ended up reading this one. The next book was a book by an author that I had previously read another book from and loved. And his second book, it was just not rated very well on Goodreads, and I just went in with the lowest of expectations, and that is Artemis by Andy Weir. So I love The Martian. The Martian is one of my favorite books of all time, definitely like my favorite sci-fi of all time. And I wanted to read his second book so badly because I loved The Martian so much, but I kept putting off reading Artemis because of all of the negative reviews. It had so many negative reviews. And I think the problem is if you go in with the expectation that this is The Martian, then you're going to be sorely disappointed. It's a very different story. It is not trying to outdo The Martian, I don't think. It is just a really fun story. And I had a blast with this, much, much more than I was expecting to. And maybe it's because I went in with such low expectations, but I ended up really enjoying this. We follow a character named Jazz who basically lives on this moon colony, who is not the best of characters, and she is definitely more of a smuggler who takes advantage of a lot of the trade between Earth and the moon, but she's a brilliant mind. So this company kind of employs her to pull off this heist, and she gets wrapped up in this bigger conspiracy, and it is so much fun. The way that Jazz has to go from being this kind of smuggler thief character to being the hero of this story, it's a ton of fun to follow her. I would say she's definitely not as likable as Mark Watney, but she has some qualities to her that I loved about Mark Watney that I definitely see in Jazz. Just her way of problem solving and how brilliant she is was so much fun to watch play out. And I just continue to love Andy Weir's writing style and how much science he introduces to the story without it bogging down the text. And he still does such a good job of balancing the action with the explanation as to why this thing could be happening, how this is actually scientifically possible. So I loved this book. I thought it was so much fun. So I definitely am glad that I went in with low expectations. I'm glad that I wasn't expecting it to be like as good or better than The Martian, because I ended up just having a really good time with it. The next book I have to talk about is The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. And the reason this is on the list is because a couple years ago I attempted to physically read this and I was not a huge fan. I liked some of the character work, but I wasn't a huge fan of the story having really no plot, at least not as much plot as I prefer in my books. But everybody on the booktube community seems to love Joe Abercrombie and rave about his more recent books. So I was like, let me give it another try. Let me see if the audiobook's available and if it's worth listening to. I started listening to the audiobook, and Stephen Pacey is the most amazing audiobook narrator. He did such a good job of bringing these characters to life and just making me appreciate the writing style so much more, and how funny this book ended up being. I loved the characters in this book so much more the second time around. I think because I knew there wasn't really a plot necessarily. I was just kind of there for the ride with these characters, and I think that helped my enjoyment a lot. Glokta is one of the best characters. Giselle is fantastic. Even Nine Fingers is such a great character. All of these characters are so different from each other. They're so incredibly flawed, but they're so fantastic. Like, they're so funny. I love the cynical, sarcastic humor in this book. I love the writing style so much. So I ended up really enjoying my second read of The Blade Itself much more than my first time trying to read it. And I ended up finishing the First Law trilogy and really enjoyed it. It's not a top favorite, but it's still one that I'm so glad I read, and I can't wait to read more of Joe Abercrombie. The next book I have to talk about is one that I had never heard of prior to picking it up, which is why I had no expectations going into it. I had no idea what it was about. And that is The Tiger's Daughter by Kay Arsenal Rivera. So this is an Asian-inspired fantasy book that follows two main perspectives of these two warrior women who are the heirs to their respective empires, but end up falling in love with each other. And the whole book is, or most of the book is told from second person, and it is told in the format of one of these characters sending letters recalling their story to the other main character. And I had not read really anything in second person prior to this book. I had not heard anything about this book, so I had no idea what to expect. Oh my God. The writing in this book is some of the most beautiful writing I have ever read. It's stunning. And I was shocked at how intrigued I was by these characters' whole coming of age story and their love story, and I was so invested. Oh my goodness, I just had to know how everything occurred. And I loved the beautiful world building in this book and kind of borrowing from several different cultures and kind of the author making her own world out of it. So I thought all of that was so well done, and I was so surprised how much I ended up enjoying this. So if you are a fan of slower paced fantasy books that concentrate much more on character development, and you appreciate really beautiful poetic writing, then I highly recommend checking out The Tiger's Daughter. I thought it was so beautifully written, and I'm really glad I ended up picking this up. I don't remember why I ended up picking it up, but I'm really glad I did. The next book I have to talk about is another one I just hadn't really heard anything about, and that is Wild Seed by Octavia Butler. So this is a book that, again, I just hadn't heard anyone really review or talk about. And when I read the premise of this one, I was immediately intrigued. It said that it was about these two kind of spirits, that one of them is this ancient spirit who has these powers that give him the ability to occupy these people's bodies to continue living forever. And he is kind of the most powerful being in this world that he knows of until he meets this other character that we follow. And she is also this powerful entity, but is very different than our main character, Doro. She is able to heal and transform her own body, so she is able to shapeshift, and she has also lived for a very long time and has outlived a lot of her family. And I thought this book did such a good job of taking both of these characters and kind of putting them up against each other and seeing how they would interact with each other, and taking their stories through multiple generations of their lives. So you follow multiple decades and kind of see how society changes around them and how they change with society. And it also really explored themes of kind of that whole idea if you have immortal characters, where you live past your children and those you love, and how you deal with that sort of emotion. And I just really ended up enjoying this so much. And I thought the writing style was really beautiful. So I'm so excited to continue on with this series and read more of Octavia Butler now. I think I'm going to read Parable of the Sower next, but I would also just really like to finish the Pattern Master series. It's fantastic. So I highly recommend this one. It's just so unique and so well done. The next book I have is A Curse So Dark and Lonely by Bridget Kemmerer, and this one I was surprised about because it was so hyped up. It was so hyped up on the community and kind of in the book world at large. It was also just a young adult fantasy, a Beauty and the Beast retelling. I haven't really read any fairy tale retellings that I've enjoyed, and I've also been striking out a lot with young adult recently. And just with how much hype this was getting, I was very skeptical. I was very hesitant to read this book. I didn't know that it would live up to the hype in my head or the hype that had been built for it. I loved it! I loved it so much! It was so adorable! Oh my goodness, this is why I read YA still, because there are stories like this that I just love so much, that just have fun characters, witty humor, fast-paced world building and plot that is just hooks you right away. The writing style was so easy to digest and get through. It was so much fun to read this book. I loved the Beauty and the Beast retelling aspects of it, and I didn't think I would. So I'm super glad I ended up giving this one a try. I think it's totally deserving of that hype. So highly recommend, if you have also heard a bunch about this book and have put off picking it up, try it out. You may be pleasantly surprised with how it manages to live up to the hype. It is so adorable. The next book I have is A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine. So this is a adult sci-fi book that I did not know if I would like because it is described as a space opera. It is about a woman who is sent from the space station to be an ambassador to this Tex-Colony empire, which is essentially one of the more powerful empires in the space system that they live in. And I didn't know that if I would like this or not because I didn't know if it would go way too over my head. I was really worried that it would be a little too science heavy. And the science fiction that I've read so far feels like it's always good beginner sci-fi. So I was very hesitant to like read a hardcore sci-fi novel. And I was also nervous because it just sounded very political. Luckily, even though I will say that this book is dense and it is very heavy on the sci-fi aspects and world building, I ended up loving it. And I love the political intrigue in this book. I loved the characters. I thought the world building was fantastic. This is definitely one you have to pay attention to. It's definitely one that it takes a while to get oriented to the world because there are so many intricacies to this world that are so different than our own. I could see why a lot of people don't like this, but I am so glad that I loved it as much as I did. The world building is so spectacular. It was just so well done. And I can't wait for the second book. So I ended up loving the story. I ended up loving the technology that was explored in this book. And I will say I probably missed some stuff on my first read of this book because it is very science heavy, but I'm excited to eventually reread this one and see if I can catch even more upon the second read, because this is definitely one I feel like you have to really pay attention to and savor in order to get the full experience of it. And the last book I have to talk about is The Oracle Year by Charles Sewell. So this one I actually found at Goodwill for really cheap, and I was like, all right, I'll pick it up. It looks like a really cool cover, and it has a cool premise, and I hadn't heard anyone talk about it. I ended up having so much fun with this book. This was such a blast to read. This is about a man who wakes up one day with all of these predictions in his head. And so he starts to realize that these predictions are starting to come true. And he's like, how do I have all of these predictions in my head? And he ends up publishing these predictions online. And when people start to realize that everything he's saying is coming true, people start to take notice, and some of the wrong people start to take notice. And so he starts getting involved with the government, starting to hunt him down, and people are just trying to figure out, how is this possible? Who are you? So he is now on the run from a bunch of different people who are coming after him for his prophecies. And oh my goodness, it was such a blast to read this book. It explored so many different things in it. It was not only just like a fun sci-fi thriller, but it also explored like how a president would react to that kind of information being put out in the world. It explored how like churches and religious leaders would react to this kind of person being out in the world with this kind of information. It was so much fun. So I am so glad that I just kind of picked this up on a whim and ended up really enjoying it. It was really fast-paced. You know, the character work isn't necessarily the best, but if you want just like a fun, quick sci-fi thriller, check this one out. It was a super surprising read, and I'm really glad I found it. So those were my most surprising reads of 2020. What were some of yours? What was a book you didn't necessarily think you would enjoy as much as you ended up enjoying? Leave those comments down below. I would love to know. Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and I will see you all in my next one. Bye!